Hello and welcome to Death with Deity. I'm your host, Jason, and with me is my father-in-law, Steve. Steve has been diagnosed with a terminal brain cancer, but he has his hope ultimately placed in Jesus Christ's saving work on the cross. The goal of this podcast is to explore how the beliefs of the Christian inform the dying process that we all must undergo. Last episode, Steve shared about how the Lord brought him to faith in Christ Jesus. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I would encourage you to make time to do so. And as for today, Steve, I was wondering if you could walk us through how you received your cancer diagnosis, what sort of emotions you experienced, and how God ministered to you during that time of shock and adjustment as you processed that.
Yeah, definitely I can do that. I think it's interesting that you use the word shock. It was definitely a shock. As I may or may not have mentioned previously, that I went to the hospital and was there having some physical ailments that just needed to be addressed. I was concerned about my blood pressure being too high, and as a result, was there getting a number of tests. And through the process of being in the hospital there for several hours, getting these tests done and talking with all kinds of doctors, I think what was weird for me is it became very, I don't know how to it was very ethereal. It was, I no longer felt like things were normal for me.
Sort of surreal?
Yeah, surreal. And as a result, they were talking to me about, the issue of having a chronic headache for days, and were there any other issues that were going on, and so then they start doing all these scans to try to figure out where it's coming from, and then this doctor comes in and just informs me that I have a tumor on my brain that is a serious tumor. Yeah. And they're going to need to transfer me to a different hospital to be with a brain surgeon who can obviously perform the surgery, but also give me more information on what was going on. And it's from the time of hearing that I had a tumor to actually...
Which is, pretty blindsiding, because you went in with high blood pressure.
Yeah.
And feeling weak and fatigued.
Yeah.
And was it anywhere on your radar at all?
No.
That this might be?
No, nothing at all. I wouldn't have guessed by any stretch of the imagination that that's what they were going to say. If anything, I'd had some similar feelings of fatigue when I had COVID a few years back, and so I thought maybe I just have some kind of a high-grade infection,
right?
That's caused this fatigue. But brain cancer, no. And my mother had died of brain cancer a number of years prior. And so it's not, I'd watched somebody go through that. And so you would think that maybe my mind might rush there, but it didn't. And it felt very foggy. And I wouldn't find out until later that the reason why it all seemed so probably foggy in my mind, interpreting all of these events and these conversations, was because the cancer had grown to a point where it was now pushing the brain up against the far side of the skull from where the tumor was located.
Sure.
And there was a massive amount of swelling. And what I probably didn't realize is that for the prior couple of days, I was probably starting to exhibit symptoms of it.
But due to the nature of confusion, you don't always recognize that in yourself.
Yeah, you don't. And so by the time I got in there, I was doing pretty bad. I was not in a very good state at all. And the doctor had mentioned to my wife, because he asked the question, "What brought you in here today?"
Right.
And she explained to him, well, his blood pressure was high, and he was just concerned, and he wanted to have that checked. And his response to her was that if I hadn't come in that day, I probably would have been dead the next day. And now I didn't hear that in real time. She relayed that to me after the fact. Mm-hmm. And I think it was even after the surgery, which came the very next morning. some of these facts I was not getting as they were unfolding. I heard about them past tense, but I think so. There was some initial shock of just not really getting the full picture, and then I think beyond the not getting the full picture, it was just not fully being able to probably process with all the swelling that was going on in my brain.
Right.
But
Your physical capacity to even put all the pieces together that you were given,
yeah,
and make any kind of sense of it.
So
even if it wasn't shocking.
Yeah. So even if it wasn't shocking, which it was,
Yeah.
But at the same time, just having all these things to deal with, and then just that the enormity of you've got a serious brain cancer. And I do know that when the surgeon came in and explained to me what it was, and he gave it a name, a glioblastoma, as opposed to just brain cancer.
Sure.
And he said it's one of the most aggressive form of brain cancers there is, and so then that again just became another shock upon a shock. So
right.
It's just, I don't just have brain cancer; I have the most aggressive brain cancer that there is. And so initially that I found that to be probably overwhelming to process in the moment. But at the same time, I think for me, it was really difficult for the people around me. Specifically my wife. I remember her just being overwhelmed by the shockingness of this news. Mm-hmm. And I immediately, the Lord brought to remembrance from, I think it's Psalm 139, where he has appointed our days. He's numbered our days. He saw them before we were even formed in the womb. Like he knew every one of them, what they would look like, what would take place.
Yeah.
And I tried to remind her that ultimately I wasn't going to live a day longer. Those days had already been written in his book.
They were numbered before you were even thought of in this world by human standards.
Yeah, before anybody knew who I was, God knew, and he had recorded them in his book that here will be the day of your birth, here will be the experiences that you'll have, the places that you will live, the children that you will bear, all these things. And so that ultimately I wasn't going to live a day shorter. I wasn't going to be robbed of one of those days because they'd already been written in his book.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be able to live past those days. And I think for me, I had an overwhelming sense of peace that all the stuff that the doctors were telling me was fine. It might be scientific. It might have some rooting in reality of this world, of the flesh, the physical, the tangible, but it doesn't have anything on the spiritual realm. And so they could think that I was going to die in the next 5 minutes, or they could think that I'll live to be 112.
Sure.
None of that matters when you realize that God has written down the number of your days in his book, and he knows them completely. And so that just for me brought great peace and comfort in knowing that. So that's pretty much how I learned and initially processed it. I think there was that initial shock.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
how could there not be?
but I immediately received comfort.
Hmm. How do you think that? I don't know if you can put yourself in the mindset of somebody who doesn't have God, who doesn't believe that the scriptures are true, who doesn't believe that God has formed us since before time began. How does somebody without faith in the Christian God, how do they deal with something like that?
I mean, I've known people who obviously don't have faith in God, a trust in something greater than themselves, where they believe that we just kind of happened on this world, and
Got lucky.
yeah, that through a weird set of circumstances, we happen to be alive and have happened to build a sophisticated culture and all these things. But the thing that I've seen is kind of a common theme for those people is that when they experience difficulty, it's the world becomes a very scary place very quickly, and because they realize they're all alone, they have nothing other than the reality that one day it will end for them in finality. It will be completely over. There's nothing afterwards, and they're just hoping that whatever that final end isn't worse than they imagine.
Yeah.
And so some of it's, everybody has a different perspective. Some people believe it's just the end. They just die and everything about them dies, and there's no memory going forward. And then for some people, they believe that no, there's an afterlife where if you were good in this life, then good things will happen to you in the next, or maybe you'll get a second chance.
Sure.
So I think some people have different perspectives of what it means to come to the end of your life. But I think at the end of the day, death is scary to all of those people, because it comes often with pain. It often comes with suffering, and it comes with this ultimate sense of being alone. When you die, it's just you there. It's not often a group of people all die together.
And there's no reassurance that the thing that stands out to me is that there's no reassurance that their suffering meant anything.
Oh yeah,
It's pointless.
yeah. It was just
pointless, hopeless, terrifying nothingness. And so whenever I try and put myself in their shoes, whenever I'm going through, and I haven't been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, but when I'm going through a difficult life circumstance and I'm in the midst of that and it's distressing in some way, I go, well, if I didn't have God, if I didn't have faith that God was doing something purposeful, if there wasn't a plan for my life, I might lose my mind. I would do some pretty crazy things. I would slip into terrible forms of coping behavior.
Exactly. I think one of the things that really became meaningful to me is that for a long time now, I've looked at the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis as an example of God's plans and purposes not always being something that we can understand or grasp. Here was a young man who had dreams and visions that his life was going to mean something.
Yeah, he was going to be a big shot.
Yeah, so much so that it probably puffed him up a little bit when you read the account.
You get that impression.
He got a little bit, haughty about it and thought, I'm going to be the guy.
Yeah.
And it's like he oftentimes gets a bad rap for that, but which one of us wouldn't do the same thing
if we had revelation from God that all our whole families were going to bow down and serve us?
Yeah, exactly. I think we would all kind of fall into that, but
especially at a young age like that.
But the reality is that he ultimately those things were all true. God did have a big plan and a big purpose for him. But it was led through a series of trials, tribulations, and suffering, being accused of many things, ultimately imprisonments, slavery. The list goes on and on. Yeah. But the thing that really I kind of took away in those kind of early days as I was sitting in the hospital and processing all of this was that the thing I remembered about Joseph's life is that all these things happened to Joseph not because God was punishing him or because Joseph was going to reap some great benefit from it all. And he might have. I mean, you could definitely look at it and say, well, he did become, the second
Sure.
most powerful
He
person.
married Pharaoh's daughter. He had affluence up the wazoo after that.
Yeah, but that's not what it was about.
No, it's not.
And so there might have been some side, benefits that came in his life, but it really wasn't about Joseph. It was about God having a plan that there was going to be a famine throughout not just the land of Egypt, but throughout the world that was going to wreak havoc on a multitude of nations. And God was working up a plan to save people out of the midst of that famine.
Mm-hmm.
And he was going to use this young Hebrew boy from the land of Canaan, and he was going to transplant him into Egypt and take him through a process of putting him before the king of that land so that he could use him at the right time, at the right place, to set him up and to use him as a vessel to save these nations and to show his greatness to these nations.
Yeah.
And by no means am I trying to say that that my brain cancer is an equivalent to that. But what I am trying to say is that ultimately God works in the lives of people many times for the benefit of other people.
Yes.
It's not about them.
And you very likely won't know it, how he's doing that.
Exactly.
Which is very difficult.
Yeah.
I think as humans, we want to know that what we're doing has meaning, but we just have to have faith that God does have meaning in our lives, that there is a plan that he has for our lives, and we might not know exactly what that is in this lifetime, on this side of eternity, but it is there, and that is the hope of the Christian faith. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
So I think after this, in the coming up episodes, I'd like to discuss the so-called 5 stages of grief, and kind of talk about how the Christian should engage with those. Obviously, they've been identified as sort of emotional periods following something distressing, following how you cope with grief. And so there is how the world normally deals with them, and obviously the Christian can experience these emotions, sometimes in sin and sometimes not. I'd like to unpack each of those separately and spend at least an episode on each one, talking about whether or not you've experienced any of those, and also kind of unpacking some scripture and talking about how Christians who are experiencing those can deal with each of those 5 stages of grief.
Sounds great.
Thank you for listening to Death with Deity. If you would like to be notified whenever Hyper Premium posts a new podcast episode, you can sign up on Hyper Premium's Substack homepage. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube.